Welcome to the Idea Land podcast, hosted by Ravi Komatireddy. Andrew Hilvers is a software engineer, digital health entrepreneur, and game developer for a AAA video game company. In this episode, Andrew and Ravi take a deep dive into gaming. Why are games so addictive? What does it take to create a game? And what role do they play in our culture?
Interestingly, of all the people I know, you are in a very creative field with gaming and technology, and such an interesting place to explore cool ideas. So can we just zoom out here and let everyone know your background, where you're from, and you're now in California doing cool things and racing Teslas around and coding from home and part of a very, very large organization doing really cool things with gaming, and gaming's been part of your life in the past, as well as digital health startups. So walk me back from Drew from Farmtown.
So I grew up in a tiny town in Ohio. The actual town that I lived in had about 150 people. That was the population. It was considered a village. And then I went to school in a city of about 5,000 people. That was about 15, 20-minute drive away. But yeah, I grew up on a farm. My dad was a mechanic for farm machinery and also farmed on the side. I mean, like legit grew up on a farm surrounded by cornfields, stuff like that.
You feel like people just say that a lot of the time, but really,
yeah, people say that they grew up in the middle of nowhere. They grew up on a farm, but like I legit did. I always like telling the story where the road that I grew up on was probably a mile long, and 3 houses on that mile long road, and all 3 had the same last name as me. Like that's the type of picture to paint. So anyway, so that's where I grew up.
It is a painting for sure.
Yeah, just think of cornfields, flat and cornfields. But anyway, so I grew up there, and then I went to college in Ohio as well. I studied game design. Thought I wanted to be a video game designer or artist. I wasn't quite sure, and then about halfway through college, kind of fell in love with programming, so software engineering, and then kind of pivoted a little bit. But it was it probably actually goes back, I would say 3, 4, 5 years old. I was lucky enough to be in a generation where video games could be a part of my entire life. So I had older brothers and sisters that had video games. They were playing them when I was younger. They let me play. I got into it. I think I got a Game Boy when I was like 6 or 7. That was kind of like my first, this is my thing. Played a ton of Pokemon. That was kind of my first game I remember, Pokemon Red. And then as I got older, I was always interested in like math and science way more than like English or any social studies or history or anything like that. So very big to math and science. I remember writing like little programs for my TI-83 calculator. Didn't know that they were that was programming. You know what
I remember that. So you were that guy. You were the guy that we all got the programs from, where you had the little wire and you like attach the wire to the bottom to the other one.
Yeah. There was like a USB you could plug into your computer. Yeah.
It was like Dope Wars and Tetris.
Yeah, I mean, I would build stupid little programs that would be like, oh, what's your name? And then you'd type in a name, and I'd just have it so it's like, oh, if your name is anything other than Andrew, like, you're dumb. And then if it's Andrew, it says you're cool. You know what I mean? And then be like, go to your friends and be like, hey, test this out. Stupid stuff like that. But it always, to me, kind of just felt like magic. You know what I mean? It was like, oh, look, I can create something. Like, I was never good at, like, making art or singing or anything like that. So for me, it was like, this is some way I can be creative.
So, I don't want to make you, there's the stereotype, right? Being in the small town and being in a more rural environment. Is it safe to say, I don't want to say the word elite, but a cadre of people that were into this that most people weren't? I mean, did technology and things like that permeate your community as much as you think it did anywhere else?
So video games were huge. Everybody played video games in my town. But in terms of computers, like building your own computers or obviously programming, like my school at the time didn't really have programming classes. They had like Microsoft Word and Excel, you know what I mean? Yeah. There wasn't like C++ or something. So like that type of thing was very foreign. I didn't even really know what programming was until I went to college because of that. Like it wasn't a thing. It was very much, people would either go farming, like kind of pick up from like their father's or mother's footsteps and go be a farmer, or they would go work in a factory, or they'd go to college, like a lot of like nurses and teachers and that kind of like, more common occupations. For me to go and say, oh, I'm going to make video games, like people for the most part thought it was a joke. You know what I mean? They're like, oh,
Really?
you can't make a career like making video games. Like that's not a thing. Luckily, my parents were super supportive. Like originally I wanted to be a lawyer. So when I was like a freshman in high school, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer.
That is so incredibly different. I just can't imagine you being a lawyer right now. What do you think when you think back to that?
So I don't know. I think it was one of those things where I enjoyed arguing with people and I could talk really fast and like, I don't know, just be kind of like a pain in the butt to people. So I was like, oh, lawyer matches that. I think it was one of those things where it was like, I watched too many TV shows that had like lawyers and stuff, which made them like seem all fancy and cool. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want to be. But it wasn't until like, I don't know, my sophomore, junior year of high school when I started applying to colleges, where my mom was literally just like, hey, what do you actually want to do?
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know. And she's like, don't think about anything. Just what do you think would be the most fun? And I was like, oh, okay, I'd love to like make video games. And
That's what she
like,
asked
all right.
you.
Yeah. So she was like, what do you think would be the most fun? And I was like, I don't know, like making video games probably. And then she was like, okay, so why don't you make video games? And then luckily at this point in time, so this would have been 2005, 2006, something like that. There were actual colleges that had actual degrees like in video games starting up around that time. There was 2 in like all of Ohio. So the college I went to, which was Ohio University, had a program and I went there and I don't know, seemed like a fun place to be. And so I was like, all right, I guess I can do this. And that's kind of how it started. But it was definitely, I remember my senior year, like during graduation, they like announced what everybody's like majoring in when they go to college. So they'll read your name. They'll be like, Andrew Hilvers, attending Ohio University, majoring in, etc. So my degree was called Digital Media Video Game Design, was like the actual program. And that's what I remember them reading that or saying that on the speaker and like people laughing, being like, what? That's not real. Like I'm not like
They were
parents and
laughing.
stuff.
Legit
They were
laughing.
like legit, not like laughing out loud, but like
but snickering.
giggling and like you hear whispers and stuff. Because I think people seriously thought it wasn't like a real thing. Like it was like a joke.
And the reason I'm focusing on this because you have such a cool perspective about it because it's played such a huge part of your life, right? Like when we worked together, it part of that reason that we were interested in hiring people from the game industry is because it has so much to do with people, how they interact with each other. So this is the funny thing about video games that it's so weird to me that people will snicker about it, like especially back then, right? Even now, it's like, oh, it's a serious thing. Yet when you look back at the evolution of the personal computer, it always seems like it was game driven. I'm thinking back to like when the Apple IIe my dad brought home, right? Like in whatever, 1985 or something like that. Everybody was playing games. It almost felt like games were the driving force behind a lot of innovation in a weird, inadvertent way. Even today, like with AI, we test them on games, right? We talk about who wins at chess and Go. And the evolution of intelligence, being able to like play games correctly, and whether those games are like Pac-Man or those games are stock markets, because games are super important. People do spend a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like entertainment in general, I will say. So you look at, you're bringing up like personal computers and stuff like that. So if you look at, games, making games, playing games, you look at making videos, so like video editing, stuff like that. And then you look at like kind of simulation, so like 3D models, art, that kind of stuff. Those are kind of the main driving factors for like a personal computer. So things like graphics card technology and CPU technology and faster memory and all of that stuff is very much driven by those needs. It used to be 10 years ago, a gaming computer and a work computer would be very different. Nowadays, they're actually very similar. And that's the newest trend, is that I think manufacturers and just people realize like, hey, why do these things even need to be separate? So if you're looking at like the best AI processor that exists right now, so that's going to be in a graphics card, and that same graphics card can go play games like perfectly well. So there's definitely like an influx of that. And I think it drives it a lot because, I mean, let's be honest. Why do people play games for the most part? I mean, it's like enjoyment. People want to be happy. So
well, that's what I was going to ask you.
People are willing to fund happiness. Like,
what is that? What is that role? Why do you think it's such a big thing? And actually, even before we get there, how big is it?
Like games?
How big is game? Yeah.
Games are huge. I think it was in 2013. It was while I was in college. maybe 2010. There was a point in the last 10 years where games surpassed like film in terms of like gross revenue. That was like a huge checkbox for people who make games, being like, look how legit this is. It's bigger than films.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's just growing consistently. And there's so many things outside of games that gamer culture that a lot of people like to say, but there's a lot of things outside of games that games influence. So you have your streaming, you have like computers, technology, stuff like that. You have entertainment. I mean, now they make movies about video games, or about people playing video games, where like, you know, you tell somebody that 20 years ago and they'd be like, what, you crazy?
Esports. Like I was watching NFL the other day, and I thought I was watching NFL. This actually happened. I mean, I was watching an esports thing. I was like Madden football, and people were just sitting at home and playing it, and it looked so damn real. It was kind of creepy, to be honest. And it wasn't until I started seeing dead players on this, I was like, oh, okay, this is a game. This isn't live.
So I mean, that's an interesting thing around esports in general, and how, you know, gaming, at least in my opinion, gaming is a sport. Like, it takes skill, there's competition, there's risk, there's reward, you know what I mean? Like, anybody who thinks they can just go be a professional gamer is like crazy, you know what I mean? Like, I work with professional gamers on a fairly regular basis for like the game that I make. And the amount of like training, playing, like even physical, like it's a lot of mental, but I know it sounds silly, but try sitting in front of a computer on a mouse and a keyboard, constantly moving, pressing buttons, and being like mentally focused for like 12 hours a day. Like, it's really hard. And that's, you know, essentially what they've done for years in order to be the best at this game. And I mean, like, you look at the biggest esports events right now. So you look at, you know, like the world championships of certain things, they're pulling in, you know, 100 million live viewers. Like, their prize pools are in the millions. Like, these are not like insignificant numbers, for sure.
Drew, when did this
it's
change?
Just gonna get higher. So,
like, people weren't doing this for Super Mario Brothers, right? I mean, when did this change? Was it really the advent of like just distributed multiplayer gaming? Is that what we're really talking about? Is this the real thing that's happened in the last 10 years, that it's been easier to connect, you know, tens or hundreds of people playing together in the same game?
Yeah, there's a couple different avenues, I think. Are we talking about just multiplayer games? Or are we talking about esports, or just games in general?
Just games in general.
So games in general, I think there's a couple different things. Number one, it's just becoming more common, and like, people are more open to it. Like, the stigmas are slowly like going away, where people would say, oh, you play video games? That's weird. You know what I mean? It's now, you know, you look at like the advent of like mobile games, for example, like iPhone games. Like, my 75-year-old mother is playing iPhone games. You know what I mean?
Really? What's she playing?
I have no idea what she's playing. She plays like a lot of card games, for sure, like solitaire and stuff like that. But the fact is that the reach, no matter what, it's like you have a device in your pocket, you are on a computer, your TV, a lot of smart TVs nowadays have games built in. It's one of those things where I think the amount of accessibility is so high at this point. Like, it's so easy for just anybody to be exposed to them. It used to be like, hey, I either need to spend $1,000 on a computer, or I need to buy $500 game console, and that's really your only options. And it's sometimes hard to find. They break a lot. Nowadays, it's like, heck, you know, you have millions of games just in your pocket every day. So,
got it. You know, it's interesting you talk about your mother playing games too, because that, like you said, the reach just for the population that is between age 5 and 15 is huge, with smartphones and tablets and things like that. But yeah, it's easy to forget that there's just a lot of people who like games, who are older now, who grew up with console games, you know, 30 years ago, and they're still playing games into their late 50s, 60s, 70s. And I wonder what that breakdown is like. So the games you've worked on, have you seen a shift in the demographics? You know, like it used to be just like a bunch of dudes sitting around playing games. Nintendo 64, James Bond in the dorm room, you know, it was like always guys. Are you seeing a change in the kinds of people who are playing games now?
Yeah, I mean, it like every game kind of genre is going to have their kind of standard target audience, or it's not even necessarily a target audience. It's just like an audience that kind of gravitates towards that. I worked on some casual mobile games in the past, and the casual mobile game market is literally ages like 30 to 60 female, like that. Like when you make Candy Crush Candy
Yeah.
Crush is targeted at age 30 to 60 female.
No way.
Yes, 100%. And it's because like that's who enjoys those games. That's who's willing to pay 99 cents because they're out of lives. You know what I mean? Those are the people who enjoy those games generally. Now, there's not saying there's not people in every age group or whatever that enjoy games. It's just like that is their market, if that makes sense. And what's interesting is the game that I work on now, our market is pretty much ages 16 to 30 male for the most part, which is kind of when you think of video games or AAA titles, like I make it work, like that's the market you shoot for the most part. But what's interesting is when I was younger, I played one of the games. This is kind of crazy. It's like when I was in college, I was playing the game that I now work on.
Really?
Yeah. So the game came out in 2010, 2009, 2010. And like I was, a sophomore, junior in college at that point. So it was one of my favorite games when I was in college. That's like one of the reasons like I kind of ended up at this job. And it's one of those things where at that time, it felt like it was a lot of 13, 14, 15, 16 to maybe 20-year-olds playing that game. But now what's interesting is that I think those people that played it then are like me and have gotten older. And now we're seeing more people in their like mid to late 20s playing this same game.
Got it.
So what's interesting about that, and like, sure, we pick up some new people, but it's majority of people more my age now. And what's interesting about that is like, that to me is like an example of how I think a lot of gaming is going, and how as we get older, like that gaming generation is going to continue to game. So we're going to continue like buying games, playing games. So everybody, right now, I would say the majority of people 35 and younger, like a majority over 50% probably play games on a regular basis, whether it's a phone game or whatever. And as that goes, now that population of people who are playing games is just going to keep getting larger because kids play games. And then kids that play games grow up and play games. So, most likely when I'm 65 years old, it's going to be, okay, everybody 65 and younger plays games. So like now we're like doubling or tripling the population of people who play games, which is already a huge population now. So I can only see games just getting bigger at this point.
The interesting thing is, you mentioned about the relationship to film, or at least the comparison to film.
Yep.
It almost seems like, because when you see a behind the scenes thing on a film, just the amount of logistical nightmares and fires that you have to deal with, right? Crew of 1,000 people, it just seems so incredibly difficult to get a film produced and made, distributed, and in the theater. Just all the different steps. What's it like bringing, like you said, a AAA game to market now? How much effort is that? Is that something? Are we on the same wavelength with film now when it comes to production of these games?
It's pretty similar actually. There's a lot of leaders from the film industry that have moved over into the game industry because of how similar it is. So for example, the game I work on, so we've been around for like 10 years and we have roughly 1,000 to 1,500 people working just on that game. And that's a game that's already released. So it really just depends on the scope of your game. I mean, heck, I've worked on games where it's been 10 people that made a game. It really just kind of depends on how big the game is. Like I believe in terms of kind of like public numbers, I believe Grand Theft Auto 5 was like the largest.
That's a great game. That's a great game.
Was like the largest budget for a game.
You didn't like that game when it first came out. I remember, because I remember it coming out and it made, I think, like $1 billion in one day on pre-sales or whatever, because people had pre-ordered it. And it was like the biggest release ever. But I remember you not being so happy with that game.
I was mad because they didn't release it on PC right away. That's why. They went consoles only right away. And then they spent like 6 more months making the PC game. I mean, I'm a big PC guy. So like I want everything to be on PC. So
why?
I'll play it.
What is with the PC? Because this division, as far as I can tell, has been growing over the last like 10 years, especially since PCs are just getting super, super powerful, and especially since some of the VR stuff works on PC. So, I had that HTC Vive. I'm sure you've been playing around with headsets and VR and AR and stuff like that too. And PCs are traditionally ones that are running now, even though now like the Oculus Quest and stuff are self-contained. Yeah, I feel like there's this step up of like hardcoreness for the people with the PC gamers versus just us normal people who are playing consoles.
Yeah, I mean, like, real quick before we go on that tangent. So Grand Theft Auto 5 was $265 million. to build.
Wow.
So that's like movie budget, huge movie budget.
That's
you know what I
bigger
mean?
than it. Yeah.
So that's my point. It's like, I mean, we've released 2 new games at work in the last, at my company in the last like 6 months. And yeah, I don't, the budget weren't that big, but I'm sure it's in the millions. You know what I mean? I don't know the exact numbers, but it's one of those things where games, like making a legit AAA title is not cheap. So, I mean, people are expensive. There's a lot of logistics. It takes multiple years. I think Grand Theft Auto 5 was like 3 or 4 years to build. Like it takes a long time. But anyways, so going back to your question about
the PCs. What is it with the PC? What's the future of the PC in gaming?
So I think it's just a combination of things, but for me, it's mainly like flexibility, customability, and experience. So when you play, the best Xbox that's out right now or the best PlayStation that's out right now, pretty much the best you're going to get is maybe 4K at like 30 FPS, maybe. Most games are going to be 1080p at maybe 30 FPS. You'll even see there's games on the current consoles that are 720p running at 30 FPS still. And it's one of those things where for me, I want to get, it's just like, why do you have a fast car if you don't, you know what I mean? People will say like, why do you have the fastest car in the world, but you only drive it to work and back? Well, I don't know. It's still just a fun thing to have. You know what I mean? For me, it's like, I want to play at the highest resolution I can. I want to play, at the highest frame rate as I can. And like, there's resolution to a degree, there's diminishing returns after you get to a certain point. But I mean, the more pixels you have, the better the image looks. The faster your frame rate is, the more smooth the picture is going to be, the less lagging and stuff there is. So generally, there is a better experience that you can get from it. But for me, it's mainly like, I like the customability. Like, so for example, most games on a PC, there's 800 settings that you can go through and tweak and be like, oh, well, what if I turn, the anti-aliasing to 8x and I make the texture resolution high instead of very high, and I make the reflections, super high or whatever. Like that kind of tweaking, that's like, that hits me. You know what I mean?
So
that's
you
why
like that?
Oh yeah, I love that.
That drives me crazy.
Yeah,
I'm just like, just run, just run it. Just turn on.
And I think that's kind of like what the consoles are meant for. It's meant so you put your disc in or you select your game and it just works. You don't have to think about it. Like that's kind of the thing. Now, I will say there is a huge convergence with the next generation consoles and PC. So essentially the consoles, when they started out, so you're looking back at your regular Nintendo, your Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, your original PlayStation, original Xbox. At that time, they were very like custom. So they weren't using like PC parts from off the shelf. They were using like custom GPUs, custom CPUs, custom software. Like, everything was very much specific to the console. And it got to the point where like I worked on a Xbox 360, PC, and PS3 game. And it was to the point where essentially Xbox and PC at that point were pretty close. So we kind of have one code base that went to both of them. But we had to have a completely kind of separate, or at least separate chunk of our code to be able to go to PS3. Because the architecture and the way it was built was so different from the others. Right. Now, with the new Xbox, the new PlayStation, and PC, they're essentially exactly the same at this point. Like they're using actual CPUs that you can go and buy and put in your computer today. They're using actual SSDs. They're using actual graphics cards that you can go and buy and put in your computer today for the most part. Now they might be tweaked a little bit for like the console, but they're essentially going to be the same. So what that means is now, for example, Microsoft already announced that any Microsoft published Xbox game for the new console will also be on PC, and it will be one, like you buy one license and it just works on both. So that's kind of the world we're moving into now. So now I think what you're going to see is you're going to see way better games on PC coming forward, because there's software that you need to write is so much, like it's so similar across them all. So be games coming out 3 years from now are going to be very similar across the three. And that's kind of always been a big thing, is that a lot of the times it's been like consoles first, PC second for gaming companies. So you'll get a really good optimized title for console, and then the PC port a lot of the times is like crappy. that was kind of like one of the things about GTA 5 is when it first came out on PC, it was like not great at all. Like it ran really bad, had a lot of bugs and stuff like that. And that's because, they didn't think about PC or didn't focus on that when they were building the console versions. But now that they're going to be so similar, now it's going to be like, hey, you're getting almost every game across all three. Every game is going to be, very optimized for all three. It's actually just a great thing for gamers in general. But yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about when I think about PCs, I think about obviously the VR stuff, as we talked about before. But the other thing is simulation, because for me as a pilot and someone who likes to race cars, being able to do that in a very non-expensive way and still get enough out of the experience where I feel like there are lessons that could be translated over to the real life activity is pretty amazing. And I can tell you from a piloting standpoint, it is way safer and cheaper to go take a plane up, and it uses like real world weather and real world photorealistic scenery. The flight dynamics are good, and it's an amazing way to experience, not just to practice, but to a lot of people where they just like actual flying isn't available to them, right? Whether it's financially unavailable or just not in their area or something they just can't do or too scared to do it. It's an ability to experience that. I've seen that happen with the sim racing. So I've got some friends who were really into sim racing. I mean, they're racing like 24 hours of Le Mans and stuff like that over 24 hours. Like there's a glitch in the ethernet, like they're done, like their team's like done, right? Can you imagine that? Like being in the last hour and someone, the power goes out or something like that and you're screwed. But it's like there's real points, and they're racing against, like there's F1 drivers on the track, like real Formula One drivers on the sim race with them as different teams. And it's just so weird because there's no other time in your life where you'd ever be able to go toe to toe with a pro in a sport like that, right? And so like the PCs and stuff are so good at running that whole sim setup and everything too, like with the different wheels and stuff. Speaking of, which is really funny, given that you're from Farmtown, have you seen things like, what do you think of things like Farming Simulator? There's all these sim games like this. What is it with the appeal that people just love being experiencing that, even though they've never even been near a farm or something?
So first off, I would say simulation style games is probably my second favorite genre of games, maybe my first. So you're talking about like racing. So I played a lot of iRacing. I have like a wheel and pedals, I have the whole setup. I've done like golf simulation. So like there's one of my friends in San Francisco had a full on like golf simulator. So he had a thing called a GC Quad, which was like a ball tracker. So you put it like in front of your ball, you hit a real life golf ball with a real club into like a projector screen, and the ball hits the screen, falls down, but the data gets sent to a computer and it shows you your shot like you're on the golf course. And it's like
awesome,
legit. And I mean, that's used by like tons of professionals and stuff like that. And there's like real life tournaments and you can play it like, same thing, but kind of getting to the farming simulator. So I think I have like 400 hours in Farming Simulator, or Farming Simulator 2019. I love that game. I think it's awesome. So like for me, it's essentially, so it's kind of like all of the good things of farming, with like none of the, well, maybe not none, but most, like not very much of the bad. So like, for example, let's say your farm's not doing well. Well, whatever, you can just like destroy it and start a new one. Who cares? Like, what is money?
Government subsidies. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. So, but for me, Farming Simulator, and I think a lot of the simulator games, so they're number one, there's like the attraction of like, hey, I can't be a professional at this, but this can like kind of make me feel like I'm a professional at it.
Yeah.
So like, you're talking about the racing stuff. So it's like, I'm never going to be able to get on a track, like a real track with an F1 driver or whatever, but maybe like in this game I can or something. And I mean, there are people in iRacing, I know for a fact, who started only doing iRacing and then have climbed the ranks and eventually became real drivers. Like that's like a real thing.
It's a real thing. And it's happening more and more. I think even on the console side, it happened, right? So Sony, the PlayStation Challenge.
It was like, Gran Turismo or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was Gran Turismo, and then Nissan was sponsoring that. And used to be that people grew up in karts and go-karts, racing go-karts since they're like 5 years old and stuff. But now it seems like there's a lot of skills that translate over. Yeah, it's an interesting community that gets created there. And it's funny. One story I heard once about a game that blew up, but when it was in production, people just didn't seem, or at least the company backing it didn't really seem to get it. I think you're going to know what I'm talking about. It's like The Sims. So there's all these different types of games, but this is a weirdly different simulation type game, right? Where you're simulating people. Mm-hmm. And it's like, there's a lot of these simulators now where like the tasks would be something like mundane, but I bet you $1 million if you did something like Office Simulator, people would play that.
Yeah, dude.
You know?
Like
instead, and they know that office work is boring. They don't want to be in an office, but they'd rather sim it. They'd play a character in that. Why do you think that is? What's the appeal?
So, I mean, I think it'll. Okay, so Farming Simulator for me, for example, I like it because it's super relaxing. So, like, I can sit in a tractor. Okay, yeah. I'll have like music playing. I'll have the ambient noise of like birds chirping or like the tractor noises and stuff like that. And I'll be like plowing this field. And it essentially, like, for that time when I'm doing that, I'm like teleported into that like life, if that makes sense. At least that's how I feel. It's like I don't have to worry about whatever bills to pay or chores to do, or I don't have to worry about cleaning up the house or whatever is in my mind right now. It just goes away. All I'm thinking about is like, I need to plow this field. You know what I mean? Yeah. And like, I think that's kind of similar to the other. So for example, there's a PC building simulator, okay, where you own like a PC repair shop, and people come and like, hey, I got a virus on my computer. Can you remove it? And it's like, yeah, of course. I'm going to do it. It's going to be great.
No, seriously, this is seriously a thing.
Yeah, it's a huge game, huge. And like you can build your own computers for people, and like you can do custom water cooling, like everything. And like, it's one of those things where if you told me like, hey, like if my neighbor came to me and was like, hey, I got this computer, it's got a virus on it, can you like take it off? I'd be like, I'm sorry, you should take it down the street. You know what I mean? Like, I never want to do that.
Exactly.
I mean? But in this game, it's like, yeah, dude, I'll click. And it's like, it's a simulator. It's not like a game. It's a game, but it's a simulator. So for example, to remove viruses, you plug the computer in, you have to install a program, which takes time. Then you have to click on the virus scan. You have to let it run, which takes real life time. And then you have to be like, oh, okay, remove viruses. And then you have to like unplug the cables and remember to take your thumb drive out. Otherwise it'll go with the customer. You'll have to buy another thumb drive. Like, it's like real, you know what I mean?
But like you said, like if your neighbor had come over with a computer and you're literally doing the exact same tasks that would take the exact same amount of time.
Yeah.
And headache, you wouldn't do it. And potentially get paid, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, I'd much rather have the fake in-game money than like the real, whatever, $20 to do that.
So I think there's a lot of this, the strategy and an analysis and things in games can be probably ported over, in addition to the technology, to things like healthcare. And for example, what I'm working on right now, which is kind of gamification and motivation for healthcare, like lifestyle change, right? Just getting people to eat right. And so we use this term gamified. I wanted to get your thoughts on it because it's such a loaded term, especially in science, because when I hear it, what I think about is, the underlying principles of why people act the way they do. And like, I think games are really good at knowing which dials to push on people with these tricks, right? And there's like a huge repertoire of tricks that you all use to do it. Things like, streak mechanics, and, you only have a limited number of lives or a limited number of money, like these resource constraints and all these things like that you do that kind of trick people to motivate them to go down a certain channel, if you will, in a game. And they're so motivated to play it, right? And even when people aren't getting paid, they're spending their time and money, not wasting their time, but basically doing something that's not giving them an immediate benefit, but they are getting benefits out of it. So the question always is like, how do we use that, right? How do we use the gamification, if you will, into these other areas, just how to live well, like our health, or how financially secure we can be. Like like I wonder if there's a credit card simulator, right? Things like that. Like, would that be helpful to people just to learn all these other life skills? Do games have a role to play there?
Yeah. I mean, like ultimately you're talking about like kind of these levers and stuff. And like these levers existed before games. I mean, look at like advertisements, for example, like print advertisements before that, or look at, I don't know, like a merchant selling something at a bazaar and like, whatever, the 800 AD or whatever. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
these things existed forever. It's more nowadays, I think, when somebody says like gamify, essentially it's like, hey, how can we take the things that have worked in games, and again, have worked throughout human history, and how can we put those into this idea in like a digital way? I think that's a lot of when people are thinking like gamify. Cause like, I mean, everybody, like every human has like some button to push on them that gets them, you know, motivated. If you're talking about motivation, like maybe like for me, for example, sense of accomplishment and competition are like the two things for me. So if you're telling me, oh, okay, I get a little star every time I complete something, and then I have the ability to show how many stars I have ranked against everybody else, and I can be at the top and maybe even get a reward for being at the top, like that for me would motivate me like through the roof. You know what I mean? Some people it's different, but I think that the main thing is the majority of games, especially kind of, you know, mass market games that aren't, you know, super like niche for somebody. So for example, like a PC building simulator, that's pretty niche. But if you look at a game like a Candy Crush or something that's like huge and like very broad appeal, I think there's a lot of different levers you can pull from those. And a lot of it is just kind of like that positive feedback loop. You know what I mean? That's like a very common thing that's talked about. And I know in games, and I think it's talked about in a lot of stuff, which is if you get somebody feeling good about what they just did, and then give them a challenge or some type of confrontation to kind of fix in order to feel good again, and you just keep that kind of thing going over and over. It's like, hey, here's a problem. Here's how, like, we're giving you the tools to solve it. Once you solve it, hey, here's like a reward of some type. And then it's just like, keep that going. And then usually you're kind of escalating. Okay, the problem gets, next problem's harder. The next reward's bigger. Next problem's harder. Next reward's bigger. I mean, that's like physical fitness in general. It's like, okay, go run. Like, that's not that hard. Go outside and run for 10 minutes. Okay. Well, if you did that every day, you would get rewarded by a little reward. Then it's like, okay, well, now if you step that up, now it's like, okay, do it for 30 minutes and add dieting and add, you know, like weight training. And you just like, you know, you keep adding to the challenge. And then it's like, oh, okay, now join like a basketball league and do this other stuff. And, you know, those challenges get harder, but so do the rewards get bigger. And the key is just, you know, I think in games, what games are so good at is they're so good at making a curve that's like very, you know, not necessarily linear, but almost like more of like this, where, hey, we'll just give you a little bit until you get to a point where you're so invested that no matter what next challenge we send at you, you're going to do it. So the
barrier of entry is really low, so you get rewarded really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, tangible. Let's be honest. Like, I mean, you look at something like gambling or you know, something like that. Like, it's the same mechanism. I mean, a lot of people compare video games to gambling in terms of like addiction and stuff like that. And it's like, you know, it's a very similar thing where we'll give you something very small and easy and free potentially. Like, look at like free to play games. Like, that's the whole point. That's their mechanism, is like a Candy Crush. I keep coming back to that. It's just a game a lot of people know is, hey, let's let you play this for free for an hour and give you like the first couple levels in that game are super easy, and they give you huge rewards, and they like make, you know, all these explosions and partying, etc. And then you get to a point where now all of a sudden, like, you're addicted. Like, you're like, oh man, I love this feeling. This feeling is great. And look how good I am. They're telling me I'm awesome. Like, everything's great. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, if you want to keep feeling this way, got to give us 99 cents.
So
people are like, oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that, especially with the free-to-play games. But are these things, for the most part, very, very intuitive to people who go into the gaming industry? Like, is this something you learn on the spot and you just copy and you're modeling from other games and gamers, or you learn from senior developers and they're passed down? Or is this something that's taught in the classroom? Are these techniques, the underlying principles, is this something that's formally taught to you guys? How much does this come up in the design stage of a game? Are there big meetings with, you know, 500 developers or people going, yep, these are the kind of things we want to hit. These are the kind of levers we want to pull.
So,
you know, like, how deep does this well go?
So So number one, kind of your first question, it's sort of taught in the classroom. It's not exactly taught how I just described it.
Right.
It's more taught like from a high level kind of theoretical stance. But we do talk about, and this is kind of the common thing you'll hear, which we call the core game loop. Okay. So the core game loop or core game mechanic or core gameplay, I mean, there's a lot of different things that you might call it, but they all mean the same thing. That's kind of where the majority of games start, and from a design standpoint.
I've never heard that before. Okay.
Core game mechanic. Yeah, core game mechanic. So essentially it's like, if you're thinking about, a new game, the first thing almost always that you design is, hey, what is like the main thing you're doing in the game? And what is like, and then you break it down into, okay, what's the main challenge of the game? How are players rewarded? And what is the motivating factor to keep them doing that? Okay. So you look at like, I don't know, like an RPG or something. It's like, okay, the main core mechanic in that game is you kill things. So you get money or resources. Well, we'll just say resources. You kill things to get resources so you can get stronger, so you can kill bigger things. That's the core game mechanic. That's like the core game mechanic for millions of games that exist today. It's like, hey, kill things, get stronger so I can kill bigger things. And it's like, but you need to focus on, hey, what is that? So like for a simulation game, okay, maybe it's a little bit different, but again, look at The Sims. Okay, what's the point of The Sims? Well, you build things so you can get more money, so you can build bigger things or more things, so you can get more money. I mean, like that's kind of like the core mechanic of a lot of games. But the key is you kind of figure out, okay, what's your core mechanic and how does it apply directly to the idea that you have? So maybe you're saying, oh, well, we're going to be in space and you're going to be harvesting asteroids and you're going to getting resources off those asteroids so you can build your ship bigger, so you can go farm bigger asteroids, and then you can, whatever. Like that's kind of how a lot of ideas for games start, like kind of on that, and then you just keep expanding. The other kind of avenue sometimes from a design standpoint is maybe like if it's a very story driven game, potentially the story can be the first thing that comes, or at least kind of completed before the core game mechanic is. But I mean, almost every game that I've worked on that's been successful, or gaming company I've worked at that's been successful, the main thing that you care about 100% at the beginning is, what is the core game mechanic and is it fun? Because like, it doesn't matter how good your story is. It doesn't matter how good your game looks. In order for your game to stand the test of time, it has to be fun at the core. Like that's the main thing. People have to enjoy playing it. So it's like kind of thinking about what makes this game fun, and then you can kind of start building bits and pieces on top of that. And it's usually kind of starts as that nucleus and just kind of goes out.
Well, Drew, what is a lifetime for a game? Like what would be considered, what is standing the test of time? Is it like you look at a game like Tetris, like I think we can all agree it stands the test of time, right? People are playing it now and still going. But what is that? Like that's obviously like a weird fluke, I'm sure. But what's something that's considered a good, hey, you spent $245 million in producing this game, that you got 1 million players worldwide, or 10 million. Is 10 years good enough? I mean, is that
well, I mean, you look at outside of your super rare games like a Tetris, but again, you got to think about it. The standard Tetris, like game itself, like the black and white original Tetris version, that's not the version people are playing nowadays. People are playing some different version of it. But what stood the test of time? The core game mechanic stood the test of time, which was for that game, it's like, hey, the mechanic is you fit shapes together, you make rows go away, you get points, and you try to get higher score, and then you do it again, you try to get higher score. That was the core mechanic, and that's what stood the test of time. And so for nowadays, like if you're building a game nowadays, you're usually hoping that it can last, again, it depends on what type of game you're making. Because like if you're making, let's say, the new Madden football game, that it's only supposed to last a year, because you're going to make a new version of it the next year. That's kind of that. There's different games that are much Call of Duty, for example. Like Call of Duty games are only designed to last a couple years, because they're going to make a new one and make a new one and make a new one. That's their model. Now, if you look at different games that are like World of Warcraft, or your League of Legends, your Dota, your Counter-Strike, you know, any of those games that are much more about being, you know, like being around for a long time, just getting incremental updates over time to keep them good. Those games, you know, at work for us, we always say that we will not green light an idea unless it could be a generational game.
20 years.
So that's what we say, a generational game. Like we say that if we make a game today, we want the people that play it today to be able to teach it to their kids.
What's
Like
the secret to that? So you talked about the game mechanic and the fundamental thing being fun, and I'm sure there's a lot that goes into that. One thing that comes into my mind, a question that comes to mind, is tuning difficulty. Seems like a really difficult thing to do, right?
Yeah.
How do you tune the difficulty so that you're not putting people off? And this is a weird principle because I think it extends way past gaming. It's just like this is like a principle for learning everything in life. When you're tutoring someone or teaching someone to do something, how do you get the difficulty right so you don't create such a high barrier early stages in the process that they just give up and go away?
Yeah, it's tricky. I would say, so the company that I'm at makes very highly competitive games that are super high skill capped. Essentially what that means is like we do a really, really good job of making it so that way it's like impossible to be like so good at the game you're not going to continue to get better. Like the games we make are very much like there's no skill cap. Like you can continually get better no matter what. Like there's a lot of skill built into it versus like, you know, oh, I hit level 100, so now I'm the most powerful person and like, you know, I can't get any more powerful. Ours is like, you know, a lot more about the individual being like good at the game versus your character being good at the game. Like everybody kind of starts at the same like level. So, you know, the thing that differentiates player A and player B is their skill versus like how they built their character for the most part. But with that being said, I personally think are not great currently at a low barrier of entry. Like all the games that we make, you know, at my job are very high barriers of entry. It's actually been a common complaint that we've gotten for years about, oh, you know, it's so hard to just like jump into this game because like people have been playing it for 8 years, 10 years. So like they're so good. And like, I don't know how any of these mechanics work. And there's like 800 features because, you know, you've been building it for 10 years and like, it's just overwhelming. So that's something where we've essentially decided as a company that we will lower the barrier of entry as much as we possibly can, but we would never do it to hurt the integrity of like the high skill cap. So we essentially design our game for the best players, for the pros. And you think about other things like sports, for example.
Right.
Basketball or baseball or golf, those sports are designed for the most part for the professionals, for that small subset of people who are playing it professionally. Like, I don't think anybody is saying like, oh, let's make basketball rims 9 foot tall instead of 10 foot tall. So that way shorter people can dunk now. Like, that's never been a suggestion. And that's because like it's designed for the pros and for the best player.
That's a really interesting analogy. You're right. That never happens.
And if anything, they make the game harder sometimes. Like they make the 3-point line farther away. And like they're talking in golf. There's a big thing in golf right now where they're trying to consider pulling back golf ball technology to make it so the pros can't hit like over 300 yards anymore on a drive. Because what's happening is like humans are continually getting better at these things over time. So like the best pro golfers now are like hitting the ball, driving the ball on average way farther than the ones even 20 years ago. So what the problem you have is all these golf courses are built for people who could only hit the ball 300 yards at best. And now there's people out there hitting it 350 yards off the tee. So now all of a sudden, like, oh, people are like, you know, these courses are too easy. So it's one of those things where I think things that have stood the test of time, mostly if you look at like sports, for example, they are built around the best people that can play it. And so I think, you know, that's one way of making your game last the test of time is building it for the best players. I know like that sounds very counterintuitive. You would think like, oh, hey, if we make the game available to everybody and accessible to everybody and in the skill level of everybody will want to play. But the problem is people get demotivated really easily if something is too easy. And that's like a hard problem. Like some of the most successful games over like, you know, the lifetime that video games have existed, some of the most successful games have been the hardest games. Like if you look at original Super Mario Brothers, like without using cheats and stuff, that game's actually really hard. You know what I mean?
It is actually
like,
very hard. I was thinking about that when you were just talking. Yeah.
It's very hard, but it's a game like almost everybody knows. And why was Mario so successful and stuff like that? Well, it was a hard game, but it was one of those games where once you accomplished the task, you felt like you achieved something and you felt rewarded and you felt motivation to go and do that challenge again. And that's one of those things where it's like, you look at, you know, you were talking about trying to use, you know, gamify like people, you know, being better for like themselves, making themselves better and stuff like that, like mentally and physically. And it's like one of those things where I truly believe if you're trying to apply game stuff to it, if you make the challenges or stuff like that too easy, then people like aren't going to actually continue to do it. You might get a big influx right away, but you're going to see people drop off like crazy.
Interesting. So there's some tuning that has to be done there for these to bleed over into these other fields. I mean, I'm reminded of probably one of the success stories to some extent, right? This game was doable because of a convergence of all these different technologies, including like AR and mobile and wireless and blah, 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 and Google Maps, right? So like Pokemon Go. And there were studies done, right? Pre and post, and people who were wearing Fitbit, playing Pokemon Go. And of course, what the result you think I'm going to say is exactly what happened, which is the people who were playing Pokemon Go actually left the house, were walking around more and interacting with the world. And you know, do you remember that weird 2 months or whatever when it was out and you would just drive around town and you'd see people just staring off in the distance, you know, on their phone. And you're like, what are people doing? You're like, oh, it's Pokemon Go. Like, what's that? It's this new game. And
I used to wake up 2 hours earlier than I normally would so I could take the train into San Francisco so I could go down like on the Embarcadero and try to catch Pokemon that you could only get near water.
See,
like,
that's
that motivation. Like you could never get me to wake up early yet for this. Heck yeah, wake up early.
So it's interesting because Pokemon Go is a collaborative game, or it could be. You could use it or use some of the underlying principles to get people to go outside, talk to each other, interact, you know, as that game, if you wanted to design that game in such a way. I'm not sure where they are now, like what their plans are, you know.
I mean, it still exists. It's obviously not as big as it was. I mean, I would consider it still healthy.
It's a great example of this AR world that it's probably going to be pretty big, right? And given the fact that like devices can run it now, the chips in current iPhones and smartphones can run this stuff. But it's interesting. The other interesting thing I saw was a study done on basically it was sociologists, right? Like, and psychologists are really interested in these massively collaborative games because people's personalities kind of come out in some ways. It's just interesting to see how completely random people interact online in these games. I remember playing a game called Battlefield, which is it was like I got sucked into this, but it was like, you know, 2 a.m. while playing in San Diego, there'd be like 5 people from Australia that you always just know. They're like doing it every night for like a month. And then there's 2 people who are from Germany. And we wouldn't talk to each other. Yet we could coordinate on the game in a very nonverbal way. And we just would know. It was like our own little tribe. All these people developing little tribes online. And we didn't do that by emailing or talking or any of the standard ways that humans interact to get friends. Yeah. And that is a really weird thing. If you think about it, you take a step back and go, how do I know these people? How do they know me? And they depend on me to be there at a certain time so we can go run the tank together and get this flag or whatever. Yet I've never met this person, you know? Yeah. And I wonder if like games like that, are they a good scientific test bed?
Yeah, I mean,
to test things like this, right? To see how people interact, or you could introduce challenges into the game or in a certain way to see how people work together to solve a problem or et cetera.
Yeah, there's been several, like I don't, of course, don't know any of them offhand at the moment, but I have read several studies around this where there has been games that were very popular and very much like either a simulation or some sort of like massive multiplayer game. And there's been like studies where they have purposely kind of did something in the world, like changed the world or did something or whatever, just to see how humans would like react to it. Because I mean, it's actually a great model for it. You know what I mean? So like for example, played a ton of World of Warcraft in the past, and you're talking about kind of like, that I would be in a guild with 200 people and I was an officer, and I had never met any of these people in real life, never talked to them outside the game ever. And it's still like, yeah, like I depend on, okay, well, this guy's our guild blacksmith. So I need to, ship him these things. I know he's going to make me this stuff. And I know we're going to be able to then, go do this raid. And we're going to have like 4 to 6 hours together where we have 40 people committed and 100% attentive. And like, yeah, it's like you have one person talking in the voice chat saying like, hey, okay, we're going to go do this, boss. Here's the strategy, blah, blah, blah. And like, that's it. Like everybody's like aligned on things. It's like, there's more organization in World of Warcraft than there is like in our own military. Like,
I was just gonna say, I mean? Like, it's
like,
almost like that. Remember that movie Spies Like Us, where at the end they're just playing Risk. They're like, okay, we got Chechnya here. It's like, isn't it just easier and safer just to play it over a game in some sense than it is to actually put people's boots on the ground? That's a fascinating way people are working together, and it's something at a scale that human brains never evolved to, right? I mean, we kind of work best and evolved to work in these little tribes of probably 50 or 200 people at the most. There is a number there, and I'm forgetting the name of that number that's been looked at. What is that first degree network that you have, and the second degree? How many people are in your second degree network, right? Friends of friends, things like that. So it's interesting to me to see how these people interact, and it seems pretty reliable across the different games. It's like people are just people through these different games. But one thing though, and I've always wondered this, just explain the appeal of World of Warcraft and why it seemed to blow up. Because like you said, these game mechanics, there's millions of the games. How do games, and everyone wants to design these games that like either, last specifically for a year or two, like things like you said, like Madden versus a generational game like what you're working on. How does one separate themselves from all the noise when you're developing a game? Like, how do you stand out amongst the trillion choices people have when they go to like the App Store or something like that?
Yeah. So I can talk about why I think World of Warcraft is great because it is one of the few games that has ever existed. And I'm talking about like classic World of Warcraft, not like the most recent expansion. So let's talk about just the original release. It was one of the very, very few games that have ever existed that had the perfect balance of easy barrier of entry, well, outside of like cost and stuff, but I'm talking about just strictly game. Easy barrier of entry, like you create a character, you pick the way it looks, they walk you through at the beginning, like very easy at the very beginning, and then amazingly high skill cap as well. You know what I mean? Like, they did a very good job, in my opinion, of that. Some people say that the barrier of entry is still pretty high on a game like that, but like it was more just time investment. So like the thing about World of Warcraft is to be the best player at that game, it's not being the most skilled player. Like, sure, that might separate you from somebody else that's played the same amount of time, but in terms like, let's say I am half the skill of you at that game, but I play twice as much as you, I will be probably twice as powerful as you. And that's kind of like how that game works. That game was all just reward time. You don't need to be skilled necessarily. You need to be a little bit knowledgeable, but reward time. And I think a lot of its success was because of that, where, I didn't have to be the best at the video game, but hey, I'm a kid. I got tons of time, so I can just pour time into this. And there was a never-ending thing to do. Like, there was never a point where there was nothing to do. There was always something to do. And everything was based on progression. So you had a character level. You had, like, every weapon had a level. Every ability had levels. You felt more powerful as you would go. Like, if you got a new sword, it wasn't like, oh, it looks cool, but I'm kind of hurting a monster the same way. It's like, oh man, now there's this monster that I couldn't kill before, but I got this new sword, and now I can just barely kill it. That's great. And I got this second new sword, and now I can kill it really easy. Like, there was a sense of progression there that they just nailed. And like, I don't think any game has done as good a job since then. And that was like, I don't know, like 2006? No, 2004. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, it's
WoW
an old game. It has been massively successful, and I remember reading reports like people were dying at some point, like in Taiwan and stuff. Like people just were forgetting to hydrate, and having arrhythmias, dehydration. So which brings up the whole thing of red flags. It's weird time because I think I heard just the other day the Japanese, this law is being passed that's being contested now by a gamer. They're trying to limit how much time online you can have to play games.
So certain countries already do that. So like,
what do you think of that?
I think it's fine to a degree. So for example, in WoW, I have multiple times played it like 36 hours straight.
Like 36 hours straight.
Right. Yeah. Where the only things I would do are go to the bathroom and eat, and that's it. I know some people that won't even do that. You know what I mean? Like, so it can get crazy, and it's one of those things where it's a mixed bag, because I see why the laws are proposed, and it's essentially for the people who don't have the self-control to prevent themselves from doing something unhealthy. This law will essentially force them to not do it. But at the same time, it's like, this is like kind of just laws in general, which is, it stinks if you're not that person and you're also having to follow that law. You know what I mean? It's like laws are, for the most part, kind of, set for like the lowest common denominator. You know what I mean? Like why is there a law against murder? If everybody thought murder was bad, there wouldn't be a law against murder, because nobody would do it. But like there has to be it because some people do it. So it's like,
yeah, definitely. So, I mean, even outside the boundaries of a strict, like the legal system, but just any system that we put in place in the home, and as a parent, I mean, what red flags, where are the red flags here? Like, where are the landmines here with this whole gaming culture, right? Like, what do people need to be concerned about? I mean, obviously not eating or to the detriment of making money and taking care of your household and your family. Those are the obvious ones. But what are the other, what are the kind of things you've seen when things don't go well with people either being addicted or just playing too much or whatever? And what can happen? And what are the signs of that? Like, is that a problem anymore, or is that something that's people kind of figured it out and it's not such a huge issue?
It can be a problem. I think one of the big problems that can come from it is actually it's probably one you don't immediately think of. But so what was, like, when people would say back in the day, oh, you shouldn't, let your kid watch TV a ton. Okay. It wasn't actually, if you actually looked into those studies of why, like, you shouldn't let your kid watch TV, it wasn't actually the TV shows themselves that was the problem. It was the commercials. It was the advertisements in between the shows. And that's the same thing with games. So like, if my, I have a daughter, if she wanted to play video games and she was playing whatever, like an online multiplayer game with a bunch of people, like World of Warcraft, if she played a ton of World of Warcraft, I wouldn't care. Perfectly fine to me. Like, sure, obviously you got to make sure they're healthy. Like, they have to like still go to school and they still have to like eat and drink and stuff. Duh. But outside of that, if the majority of her free time was spent playing World of Warcraft, fine, not a problem. Now, if the majority of her time was spent playing, one of those free-to-play mobile games that are built off of advertising, off of, monetization, that are modeled off of gambling, all of that kind of stuff, then I would have a huge problem. And that's like, so I worked at a company who did free-to-play games, okay? So this was in Austin, Texas, okay? I was not working on a free-to-play game, but they did make free-to-play games at the company. And almost half of the people at the company that were in positions that were around like game design, around like game modeling, or not game modeling, financial modeling, like monetization, stuff like that, were almost all ex-casino employees.
Really?
Like people that used to work in Vegas at casinos. Yes, because that's all free-to-play games are for the most part. A lot of them is like, how can we get people addicted and then get them addicted to the point where they're just spending tons of money? Like, that company had individuals who were playing a free-to-play game. We had hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals who literally were spending over $10,000 a month.
$10,000 a month.
A month on these free-to-play mobile games. Like,
so where's the line then? Like, why aren't people doing that with World of Warcraft? I mean, what's the real difference? I mean, if you're using the same underlying game mechanics, I mean, are we splitting hairs? I mean, isn't the same the potential to be just as addicted, or what's different between something like WoW?
So I think there
this?
is potential to be just as addictive. I think the difference though is you're essentially addicted to fun. I know there's a weird like limit here. So it's like one of those things where how do you separate someone who takes drugs all the time and is addicted to the feeling they get when they're taking drugs, okay, versus someone who goes skiing every day and is addicted to the feeling of skiing? Like, how do you separate those two? You know what I mean? And it's kind of, it's like a fine line, but it's a similar thing where for me, the big thing I don't like about these free-to-play mobile games is they're designed around getting you addicted to the point of making money off you. Like, they don't care if you're happy or not. They just care if they're getting your money. Where a game like World of Warcraft, it may be a little bit different nowadays. They've put in microtransactions and et cetera. But a game like that, where you paid them a subscription, you said, I'm giving you $10 a month, and that's all I have to give you, and I can play this game unlimited amount of time. They didn't give a crap about how much money they made off you, because they made the same amount of money off every person. What they cared about was that you were having fun and you were happy. And like, I think that's kind of the difference. And that's like, for example, where the company that I work for currently, like, sure, we have avenues to make money in our games, duh, otherwise we wouldn't exist. But our core message always, like, our most important metric is game hours. Like, how often are people playing the game? That is, we don't give a crap. Well, we care. Sorry, that's okay. I'm being a little facetious, but we obviously care about money, but that's like not the main focus. Our main focus is, are people playing it a lot? Because that's indicative that they're having fun. And that's the thing, is like, so that's kind of like how I differentiate those a little bit. Plus, like, for me, another thing too is, I think that spending a ton of time in in a video game that has an online component where you're interacting with other humans, like, for me, interacting with another human in World of Warcraft is at the same capacity as interacting with them in real life. Like, to me, I do not see a difference. Like, if you're having a voice chat, if you're, sending them a text chat, whatever, like, in my opinion, you're still having social interaction. And if anything, maybe like this type of social interaction is easier because, like, hey, you can just meet, you don't have to like schedule, like, oh, when am I going to see you? Like, where are we going to meet? Like, all this stuff. And like, I think social interactions are very important as like,
so the Ready Player One world to you is something that's not some evil dystopia. I mean, it's hey, people are still hanging out, they're doing things, they're getting things, they're going to school online, they're in this virtual world together, and that's something that you wouldn't mind seeing.
I mean, if you're talking about like what's an awesome future world for me, like, I hope that before I die, but probably not, but before I die, there is, like, I think our future is to upload our consciousness, so like everything that's going on in our brain, into some form of either machine, computer, whatever you want to say, software, etc., something. And then we essentially can now live forever because of that. Like, I think that's what the route that if immortality is ever achieved, it's not going to be because like, oh, our bodies can now live forever. I don't think that's ever going to be the scenario personally. Because like,
there's a lifespan. There's a shelf life to human cells.
Exactly. So like, for me, it's most likely going to be a way to transfer our consciousness into something that doesn't deteriorate. So like, what at what point is it any different for your consciousness to live in something with everybody else's consciousness and then communicating, talking, having whatever that way?
Well, that's always been, I mean, assuming that we get to the level, I don't necessarily disagree with you on that, on that vision. What is interesting though, is that assuming that if we are at that level of technology, you would have systems in place to be able to take care of like the more mundane things in life. Like, I'm not saying farming is mundane, but you could probably remote just AI operate that. So there's a lot of these things that are being done every day, which means, and this has always been the question,
that's already starting to happen. Like, my dad tells me all the time, like, so a lot of tractors nowadays, you type in like a GPS pattern of your, and then you sit in the cab in case anything goes wrong, but it'll drive all by itself. So you just like start program and stop.
It's the whole the utopian vision of the universal basic income, and all the other stuff is taken care of for you. So what do you do every day, right? So
Yeah,
it's like the Star Trek universe, and it was always just assumed in the Star Trek universe, right, that it was, oh well, we're just going to go better ourselves and go do the things we want to do. But there is this fear, right?
Find out new stuff,
learn. But the fear is, well, why do that when I can just sit at home? And if you're going 36 hours straight for World of Warcraft, how many people are going to be doing that even to more extreme? If I had to actually flip the switch a little bit on the combo, just to say, because I just thought of something that I've wondered just hearing you talk about this, because you have such a great knowledge of the evolution of all of this in culture, right? Going back into like the Hall of Fame of games, what game do you wish you could have worked on? Like, you know, like there's a couple games that stand out for me. I'm not a huge gamer, but I'm a, you know, like for me, like Microsoft Flight Simulator, you know, the golden, I think I got a C in chemistry. Like my only bad grade in college for the most part was because of GoldenEye on N64. When N64 came out, the graphics it blew everything else away.
Yeah.
And it was just four of us sitting there playing that game for hours and hours and hours, and you would just get really good. But from a developer standpoint, are there any games that you're like, damn, I just wish I was a part of that team when they made that? They had no idea how big it was going to be or how cool it was going to be.
The original World of Warcraft, that for sure. Like, I've wanted to work on a game like that forever. I would say the original World of Warcraft and Pokemon Red, or Pokemon Red, Blue, Green, which were like they all came out at the same time. But yeah, those are the games. Like, I still to this day want to, you know, make my own version of each of those games. Like, that is, like, I mean, there's nostalgia factor for sure, but there's also a reason that those games have lasted the test of time. You know what I mean? Like, there's still Pokemon games. And the thing about, like, I keep bringing this up, but the most recent Pokemon game has the exact same core mechanic as the original Pokemon game. It's exactly the same, which is you go out, you catch Pokemon, you train them, you battle other Pokemon, and you win. And when you win, what do you get? Oh, well, your Pokemon get experience, which make them stronger, so you can battle harder people. Like, I mean, it's the same thing, but like those two games for sure, 100, like 100%. And then like on top of all that, I've always wanted to work on like a sports game.
Really?
I really like sports games, so like I've always. Like, I remember playing Tecmo Bowl on regular NES way back in the day with my older brother. That was my jam. And then there was a baseball game for regular Nintendo where it was like pretty ahead of its time, because you could like create characters. Like, you would create your whole team, and you got like points where
Which
you could
game
like.
is this? I remember this game.
I don't know if it was.
What was that game? Because you had to create the whole roster and everything.
Yeah, and then like as you played, it would I think it was called Bases Loaded. I'm pretty sure it's called Bases Loaded.
I think you're right. I just
looked it up. So but the cool part about that game was it's kind of a similar mechanic. You'd play games, you would get stat points, and those stat points could be allocated to your players, which made them better, which made them easier to win. And then as you won more, then you could get more points, and you know, that same thing. And then also, Tony Hawk Pro Skater was another one that
That's a great game. I forgot about that game, but that was also super addictive because there were so many skills you could learn, and you could apply them on so many areas of the level. So you could, like, it was impossible to exhaust the possibilities.
Of
that game. Yeah. And like you were saying earlier about just being, it was like the cool skater surf crowd, which me, a boy from Missouri, was not a part of. Right?
Oh yeah.
It's like I got this little window into this cool thing where, you know, like the Red Bull generation, you know, that whole crew.
Yeah.
It felt very MTV. So that leads to the question though, Drew, like, you have been working on this stuff and you know how to create games. Have you just thought about, you know, is there kind of a list of projects in your head where you're just like, you know what, I think it's time for me, or at least there will be a time when I'm going to go create my own game or create a startup and do it?
So like for what it's worth, I have a Google Doc that started as like some other doc that started as like written down in a notebook, but like essentially every idea that I've ever had for a game, I like jot down in this, and I look back and some of them are really stupid. Some of them are great.
Anything you want to share?
Nah, I mean, nothing really. I'm actually, it's funny so I tend to do this always where I work my like normal, like full-time job. And then, where I'm essentially for the most part being told what to do, you know, to balance that, I always have like a personal project that I'm working on, 95% of the time, the personal project doesn't turn into anything. You know what I mean? There's this kind of WoW style, so World of Warcraft style game that I was working on, where I was writing the front end, the client, the server, like everything. It was going to be like an MMO, so massively multiplayer. It was going to take place in space, very similar to WoW, but instead of like a character, you have a spaceship. Okay. And then, but like, you know, very similar, like you go out, there's like quests, you got to go do your quests, you got to resource gather off planets and stuff. You have to build your base. You have to protect it from other players trying to attack you, whatever. I probably spent, I don't know, 1,000 hours working on this game.
Really?
Like that's how like in depth I got, you know what I mean? And then, yeah, I just kind of like, and then just kind of scrapped it. You know what I mean? Like I still have the code. It still exists. Like it's like in Git, but it's like, it's one of those things where it's just like that. I do that a lot, but I just enjoy the act of doing that because it's like, you know, maybe at work I'm building a feature and, you know, something as simple as like, oh, I wish I could use this programming language instead of the one I have to use at work. Okay, fine. Well, I'm doing this thing at my home. I can do whatever I want. So like right now, for example, since like the whole COVID stuff, I started golfing more because like I mentioned, that's like an easy thing to do. So I wanted an app that could track my golf distances. So like how far do I hit my driver? How far do I hit my 7-iron on average? Okay. And you go to the App Store, there's a bunch of them, but like none of them really did exactly what I wanted. And there was a couple that were promising, but they were like really expensive. They were like $10 a month, like subscription. Okay. And I was like, man, this doesn't seem that hard. So I spent like the last like 3 weeks and I just built myself the app that I want to like use for myself. And that's like a stuff that I tend to do.
Are you putting it out there? Is it going to be on the App Store or something like that so people can take a look at it?
Yeah, it surprisingly wasn't as hard as I thought. And it's like fairly polished. So yeah, I'll probably put it on the App Store and just see what happens. It's one of those things though, where the point of this is that I'm less about necessarily like, hey, I want to quit my day job and like go do this fun thing, because what I've done that essentially. And what I've found is that having your own startup is, even if it comes from an idea that you think is like fun or whatever, it does like make your fun hobby thing turn into work essentially. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And sometimes that can work and sometimes it's great, but there is a fine line there. And for me, I would rather just, at the moment at least, in my opinion, I'm working my dream job right now. Like, you know what I mean? Like I don't have aspirations of like, oh, this other job would be my dream job. Like what I'm doing currently is my dream job. So for me, it's like, I'd rather just do that and then just kind of have no consequence, no pressure, no timelines, no deadlines, nobody telling me what I have to do, and just kind of do it on my own. And if I put this in the App Store for 99 cents and it sells 1 million copies, great.
Yeah.
Woo! But if I put it in the App Store for 99 cents and it sells 13 copies over the first year, which is probably what's going to happen, that's okay too. Because like, whatever, I had fun building it. So like, it's much more about the journey than the destination in terms of that kind of stuff.
And it does seem like that specifically in software development, because it seems like you don't have to throw away code, right? Like once you figure out how to do something, it seems like it's modular enough to where you can, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can use that in other areas for future projects.
And that is something I do all the time. So I'm a huge believer in like reusing code and stuff like that, which is like, you'll be surprised at how much stuff at like big companies that make billions of dollars literally is just written for like one tiny thing and then never used again, which makes like no sense. So for me, it's, I'm a huge believer for that. So like essentially every single thing I do for my personal projects, I build in a way where I can utilize it. So like this golf app, one of the reasons I could build this and I probably worked on it for about 40 hours of time so far at this point. The reason I'm able to build a legit app in 40 hours is because I have, thousands of hours of other code that I can pull from, you know what I mean? So it's like, oh, I don't have to come up with like the way like the UI transfers from one page to another. I can just pull that from something here. Oh, I don't have to worry about how do I save data like to disk so that way I can use it later. Oh, I can just pull that from here. And like at the same thing too, is like I'm also learning things. So now when I go to my day job or try to go to my next job or whatever, like my arsenal of things I know is just bigger. So it's very beneficial, I think.
That's pretty cool. That's really cool, actually. And so in that case, what should we be expecting, the people who aren't so deep into the game world, but more the customer side? Like, what's exciting you? What is the experimental stuff going on in games, and what should we be excited about being able to experience in the next year or two, let's say?
Yeah. What's interesting is we are at the point. So I would say a couple years back, like the new hotness was like VR and AR. Okay. For what it's worth, that's actually seems to be kind of dying down a little bit for the most part. Like there hasn't been many leaps and bounds there.
Why do you think that is? You think it's a technology issue, or it's just is not as engaging as people thought it would be?
I think the barrier of entry between, like, obviously anything like new tech wise is going to be expensive. But I think it was just a little too janky based on the marketing that it got. I think if it would have been marketed more like, hey, here's like this new innovative thing. It's like super alpha. It's going to be a while until it's like ready. You know, here you go. Like that's kind of like what like Tesla did with like the first Roadster and then like the first Model S even. They were like very transparent where they're like, hey, this car is really expensive. It's not going to be the best car we ever make. It's probably going to have issues, but what you're doing is you're helping us make it better. And now you have like the Model 3, which I have. That's a really great car.
That's funny because when I first got the HTC Vive, I was scared because I'm a huge Apple user. So I have like MacBooks and I have the trash can Mac and everything. And I don't game with it because it's not really conducive to gaming, but do everything else in life with it. I had not owned a personal computer with Microsoft, anything installed on it for years. I mean, like 15 years. So when I got the HTC Vive, I knew the setting up of the Vive would be pretty straightforward. I have mic stands and light stands at home, and I just kind of repurposed them to do that. So I put like the cubes up, and super slick on the interface. Or all the hardware was super slick, right? The whole thing was cool. It came in the box. It was really easy to understand. The part that scared the crap out of me, and I was literally like, "Oh God, I don't want to do this," is the Windows piece. I was like, I don't want to deal with Windows. I don't want to turn this computer on. And so I think that I'd either asked you or somebody else, like, just get me the PC, like point out the one with the graphics card necessary to run this thing. And at the time it was I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's like the GeForce 9 million, the titanium, blah, blah, blah. I don't remember what it was, but I remember it just being like super expensive. It was like expensive as a computer, the card itself. And I was pleasantly surprised. It came in a box from Amazon. I opened everything up, and everything it installed in 30 minutes from box to getting into the VR world. 33 minutes, I think is what it was. We timed it. And that's setting up all the hardware and the tracking stuff too. And for me experiencing Windows for the first time since like the Weezer video on the Windows 95 disc back in the day. I mean, that's like how long ago. So I was like, wow, they've really come a long way in making this just super easy to set up. But I could see how it could be a very, very difficult barrier for parents trying to set it up for their kids or something like that, or try to navigate the stores or get the apps. That's where I saw the problem was with the games and the apps. Like there were some out of like the 6,000, there were like 9 that were engaged.
The games were the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, like, look at it. Like you have, whatever, like a Nintendo Switch, okay, which is like a underpowered Android tablet. Like the hardware is pretty not great for the most part. The controllers are okay, but like the screen's low res, it's not very powerful. But what sells in a Nintendo Switch is the games. I mean, that's been Nintendo's model forever, is who cares what our console is? If we have the best games, people will buy it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's kind of where I think VR is lacking. Like if there was better games, it would be selling more, but you combo the lack of good games mixed with the fact that it's like you're buying this super expensive piece of hardware and then you get it, you realize, oh crap, now I got to also buy a computer.
Yeah.
It's like there's just a lot of stuff. But anyway, so that VR is kind of like the old hotness. I do think that it'll still trend and it'll hit mainstream eventually, but it's like a slower trajectory than it could have been if they would have done a
So
little
we're
bit
still
better
on the
at the
rise
beginning.
there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Essentially what I would wait for is there's going to be, at some point, there'll be there'll be like a generational leap of VR, which will be like super streamlined, like no wire, like, so you're just wearing a headset, no wire.
Yeah.
You'll have like the software integrated perfectly. I mean, ultimately what might be the best is for there to, it's a mixed bag, because it's like competition is good because it makes like the, Oculus versus HTC Vive or whatever. Competition is good because they're trying to one up each other. But at the same time, as a developer, if you're trying to build something that works across all the different VR headsets, it's very hard. But if there was only one, it'd be a lot easier and you'd have a better experience. That's why the Index, the Valve Index, that's why Half-Life Alyx, the most recent VR game that's like good, works so well on that, is because they built it for the same people built both. And like, and that's kind of like what Nintendo does, with their first party titles. And it's, so in my opinion, the next step of VR should be cheaper, better. And then let's pray that they have good like games to go with that kind of push. And then I think things can hit a good market. But anyways, I actually think what the newest version or the newest kind of technology thing is going to be is actually just going to be around just realism in general. So where games are right now is we're kind of like, we've actually kind of hit a peak where, and you're probably familiar with the like uncanny valley term, where essentially you have a piece of computer simulated human or environment that looks very close to real, but not real enough to trick you, so that you like feel uneasy seeing it, essentially. So like a good example is like Polar Express.
I was just going to, that's the one that always gets brought up because it's creepy. The suspension of disbelief stops.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not immersed anymore.
So
because you're just like, that guy looks odd.
But with the next generation of graphics cards that are coming out, so that would be like the 3000 series from like NVIDIA, okay? We are going to get in like the newest Unreal Engine that they've been showing off for the PS5. We are getting to a point where we can, I believe, break through that and get to the point where like film is now. Like, if you have like a CG character in film, it still looks like it tricks you. You know what I mean? Like you watch the most recent Avengers movie or whatever, like half that stuff is computer generated, but it tricks you, it's no problem.
Yeah.
I believe we are going to be able to get to that point in the next 5 years for games, and games are going to take this jump from where they look now to literally looking like you're just watching a video. You know what I mean? Like you're outside, like looking at this rock or whatever.
And you think that's you think that's going to lead to more engagement? Because that is a treadmill that has kept running, right, for the last 30 years, this improvement in just pixels, like better pixels coming to your eye at faster rates that look fluid and smooth. Is that the right treadmill to be on though? I mean, what about the collaborative gaming, like we talked about immersion with motion tracking, other tools like that? I mean, is this just chasing something that really isn't there going to be a hard stop to that where people don't care anymore? Like, it'll be like, this is good enough to where
there is going to be a hard stop where it's literally just going to look like you're looking at it in real life. Like there's going to be a point where we hit close enough to that there's not really anything worth going there. And I think we're at a point now where very few games coming out, almost none, are like actually unique. You know what I mean? It's almost always like either a rebrand of a previous game, a game mechanic that's already been out before, or mixing and mashing other games together. That's kind of where we're at now. So I think that there's not very many levers to pull at this moment in time. So we're kind of just focusing on one that we know will help, and that is like visual fidelity. So like, if you can always sell a game by saying, look, it looks beautiful, at least right now. You can always say, look how good it looks. Like that's like, if it's fun, people will continue to play it. But if it looks amazing, that'll get you press, that'll get people to buy it, like, et cetera. So I personally believe that right now the focus is going to be on visual fidelity, mostly around like lighting and audio, like actual texture quality, like photorealistic textures have existed for a long time. Like you can take a picture of somebody's arm and make it into a texture in a game. Like that's a real thing you can do. The issue that you have is mainly around real-time lighting. So like when you can put somebody in a video game that doesn't move, that looks amazing. But as soon as you move either that character or the camera moves, that's when it becomes an issue. That's why when, Avengers renders out a CG scene, if the scene is a 30-second scene, it takes it a week to render it out because that's how much processing power it takes to make it look real. Where games, everything has to be real time. Like it has to render it the same amount of time that it's displaying it. Like you can't be out of sync. So that's where, new techniques in like lighting and shadows and reflections and audio are going to be huge going forward. That's what's going to take current games from where they are into that level of like photorealism. So.
Got it. And you mentioned like the game mechanics have been pretty well thought out or pretty reliable over the years. Yeah. Are there any taboo areas or game mechanics that people are just hesitant to try, even though there's potential for them to work?
Nah, not that I know of. I mean, I think games are pretty open to trying everything. Like topics, content, game mechanics, you name it. Like there's a game pretty much for everything out there. You know what I mean? And like there's like games that are literally made where it's like this game is made specifically for you to like lose 800 times before you win that one time and go to the next level. Like there are games that are that level of like, just like the game is, it's not that the game is even hard. The game is like designed to like punish you and make you feel bad. Like there's games like that out there. There's
like
games that
what's a game like that?
So like one people like to always bring up is like Dark Souls or Demon Souls is like a future one. So like that's like a game that's notoriously difficult. And there'll be points in the game where like everything will be going fine. And all of a sudden there'll be like a monster come out and just like one swing kill you. And it's just like, oh, okay. So there's other games. There's other games where it's like more of like an online MMO type game like World of Warcraft. But like when you die, your like character's dead like forever. So you could have like 250 hours into a character, all this equipment, all this stuff. And it's like, oh no, you accidentally like, I don't know, ran into this monster that was too hard and you die. And it's like, oh, it's gone. Gotta start over. Like there's games like that. That's like a mechanic that maybe people in the world would think is like taboo, but like that exists.
But can you imagine just that startup space, that room where they're thinking that up, like the first, production meeting number one, like what are we going to do? And that getting greenlit. That's just a really weird conversation to think. Yeah. Right. At a multi-million-dollar game.
That's usually like the way those ideas happen is somebody like the majority of people on the team like formed around that idea. So it'll be like, hey, I work at my company. I have a friend who works at that company. I have another friend who works at another company. And we're like, dude, we love games that are super hard. We should just like get together and make this super hard game. Like that's how that type of thing happens because otherwise like it would never get greenlit. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like an executive at like at EA or something would never be like, yeah, let's make that game. Like it would just never happen. So.
The funny thing, this just popped in my head is something that's a weird mix of a game and video, literally a video game. Do you remember that Netflix show that came out? Was it like 6 or 7 months ago where it was like basically a choose your own adventure book?
Yeah.
And you could use the remote.
I didn't do it, but I do remember it. Yeah.
I thought it was kind of the story itself was interesting to some level. It wasn't super engaging. And it obviously is like, a total alpha stage, right? This is like a new thing that they were trying out. But I got to say the potential for something like that is, to me, I thought was huge. It didn't seem to catch on. I think people were detracted by the level of storytelling that was there. But you can imagine that if you just got like, Aaron Sorkin to write your script, right, for an hour and a half, you get to film a shit ton of film, a ton of endings, more than, like remember how many fingers we used to use to put in those choose your own adventure books when we were kids? Yeah, so it's like more than that. But if you pulled that off, it's funny. It's like it starts to blur the lines between what's a game because you kind of are controlling this weird dude, with your remote control. I forgot the name of it.
So for what it's worth, like it was kind of a new idea putting this on like Netflix, but this type of game has actually been out for like
absolutely
for a long time.
Right.
Like there was a game, God, I'm trying to think of the name of it right now. I can't think of it right now. Oh yeah. So there was a game called Heavy Rain that came out.
I remember Heavy Rain.
Was it Heavy
Yeah,
Rain?
it was. I think it was. It was on PS4.
Maybe it wasn't. Was it Heavy Rain? All right, I'm looking at the
It was
video
like the
right now.
detective. It was the detective story kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Oh
You
yeah.
would make
Heavy Rain.
choices. Yeah.
So yeah. So essentially, it was like you're a detective. You're trying to solve a mystery, and it was like an episode of CSI or whatever, essentially. And like, yeah, you would just get into like you don't like play the game really. It's just you get to like a spot, and it'd be like, hey, what thing do you want to do? And you'd be like, oh, I want to say like, I think you're lying. And you go like, and then it just like plays out a cutscene based on that, and then you kind of just move on to the next thing. So it was like, I remember that game was very much like innovative. You know what I mean? That was like a new idea nobody was really doing at that time. And it's one of those things where it's like,
It hasn't seemed to really catch on. It hasn't really caught on in a mainstream way.
yeah. So
interesting.
So,
well,
yeah,
listen, so you talked about the passion project you're working on with the golf thing, but is there anything else that we should know about that you're working on, or things that are kind of in the ideation stage?
Not really. It's funny is like the PC building simulator game. Like I totally had that idea. Like I'm not even kidding. I had that idea, and I started a Git repo for it. I started like a project. I started writing some of the foundation stuff, and I was like maybe like a week in, and then I saw like a press release being like, "Hey, this game's coming out," and I was like, "No!"
What's it called? What's that game called?
It's literally called PC Building Simulator.
Oh, awesome. So the simulation games, because I'm Asian and I'm a doctor and my parents made us do this. Do you remember Life and Death? It was like the surgical simulator. And I find it funny that people really haven't made any good medical games. Like not like there's the surgical simulator one that's out now that's really funny. Like it's comedic.
Yeah.
But there was one that was like, there were two games that came out, was like Broderbund, or like I had released it or something. It was like 89 or 91. And there was like a sequel. It was called The Brain. You did brain surgery, and it was crazily accurate. Like it was crazily accurate to the point where my dad walked in. He's a physician. He's like, I see you're giving lidocaine to this patient for a heart. I'm like, he's like, how do you know how to do that? I'm like, it's a game. He's like, what? This is a game? And I just think it's funny that there's no money in it, or it's not as interesting. But it is, as it sounds to me, maybe because I'm a physician, but it seems like there's enough doctor shows on TV where if you could simulate being in that environment and doing that, people would do it.
Yeah, no, I think, I would assume there's some hesitation around like the risk of being like, oh, well, we don't want to like give people like medical ideas that aren't like real. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, I did it medical, I did it in surgeon simulator, so I can just like cut my own arm off. Who cares?
Yeah, that's true.
I do see that there's a autopsy simulator.
Oh my gosh.
That's currently in development.
Autopsy simulator. So where do you check? So how do you keep track of what's coming out and stuff? What's your source of information for all this?
So it's mostly like Reddit and YouTube. So I like, what's funny is if I was like a single dude by myself, I would not have a Netflix subscription, no Amazon Prime, no Hulu, nothing. Like I just only watch stuff on YouTube. Like everything I watch is on YouTube.
Yeah.
And then Reddit is probably the other main. Reddit and Twitter are the main like areas I find information on stuff. But like, so for example, I follow a couple different YouTube shows that are just like, one of them is literally like daily like gaming and technology news. And it's like a 5-minute video, super short. And it's just like, hey, here's like the new gaming, the new tech, the new phone, things that are like happening today. And a lot of those will talk about games and stuff, but yeah, and it's like, it's kind of hard to escape like in my office or, in my job.
Absolutely.
Like we have like an OT games channel where literally people just like post any game like they see, like in there. So like you see it a lot and whatnot.
Well, Drew, this has been like fascinating for me just because like this is a side of your knowledge base I never get to access, and it's so cool that you're kind of back into this now full time. And it is your dream job. And that's an amazing thing to be able to say. Right. So this is a very cool space, and I really need to start talking to you later about how to get the right hardware in the house here so we can start engaging in these new games. The AR stuff is just super interesting to me because it's accessible because I have a phone that can do it, right? I have an iPad and a phone that can do it. And it's like, I'm interested to see where this is going to go.
Yeah. I think the AR thing is just like trying to find a like use case that a wide market of people would care about, and then, you know, executing on it. So
yeah. Well, how can people find you and find out what you're up to? Are you on Twitter?
I am on Twitter. You could check my official, like, not personal Twitter, which is like Andrew on Tech. I used to have a YouTube channel back in the day.
Andrew on Tech,
where I used to like do PC building stuff, and
I believe I made a video challenging one of your ideas on Andrew on Tech. I believe.
Yeah, that was real. This was all before I had a kid and I had tons of free time. So, but yeah, I mean, you can follow my Andrew on Tech Twitter. That is probably the easiest way to get information. I'll post on there like when I release like my golf app and stuff like that. It'll be on there. So.
Yeah, let us know about that for sure. And what else? You know, what do you need right now to succeed? Is there anything that people can do for you?
No, you can shoot me app ideas. I cannot see, the thing is, like, mobile apps, I can make mobile apps in like a hot minute. Like, that's easy peasy. Like making like a huge PC game or whatever takes a lot more effort, but I can make an app in a day. So there's an app you want that doesn't exist, let me know. Well,
I do have this startup I'll have to tell you about later. But I'll always take up offers like that. Cool. And this has been an awesome conversation. I've learned a lot from it, to be honest.
Yeah, it was fun.